We're happy to have you join us today. Welcome to Integrate Online. This is presented by West Virginia University Reed College of Media, which offers renowned online master's degree programs in marketing communications. In today's session, which is being held in conjunction with WVU Diversity Week, we'll be discussing communicating culture change. We have Toyin Awesu with us. She's the Director of Communications for the Congressional Black Caucus for the U.S. House of Representatives, and Chelsea Fuller, the Deputy Communications Director for BLACKBIRd. We just ask that you keep your mics muted for the session, and you can post questions to the chat. So to get started, I'm just going to ask Chelsea and Toyin to introduce themselves. Chelsea, if you want to go ahead and go first.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all so much for inviting me to participate in this today. I've been really looking forward to the conversation. Like it was said, my name is Chelsea Fuller. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Deputy Communications Director at BLACKBIRd. BLACKBIRd is a firm that was birthed out of the Ferguson uprisings in 2014 that provides strategic communications and different forms of movement building capacity support to organizations around the country and internationally who are fighting for liberation and fighting for social change. I'm a proud alum. I graduated from the Reed School in 2011 with my degree in journalism, and did not get the chance to go to this fabulous program that you all have now. I got my master's degree at American University in Strategic Communications and Grassroots Advocacy, but WVU is home for me, and always happy to be in conversation with folks up on the Hill. So happy to be here.
Great, thank you, Chelsea. We're happy to have you. Toyin, can you give us an introduction?
Great. So my name is Toyin Awesu, and I'm currently the Director of Communications for the Congressional Black Caucus. The Congressional Black Caucus is a 55-member strong a caucus of Black lawmakers on Capitol Hill. We cover both the House and the U.S. Senate. Currently, our member is a Vice President candidate with Vice President Joe Biden, that's Senator Kamala Harris, excuse me. I graduated from Temple University. I have a bachelor's degree there in journalism, and I also received my master's of science degree here at the WVU, through the WVU program. I'm actually in the program the year that they were changing the name. So my cohort was a part of the name changing process. So when the School of Journalism changed its name. I've worked also, prior to coming to working on Capitol Hill, I was the Senior Communications Manager for the National Democratic Institute. And there I worked on their communications programs, primarily for our Sub-Saharan African programs, Asia, and our Gender, Women, and Democracy. And there we're focused on building democratic institutions across the world and helping civil society and civil society partners work on democratic principles and building good governance in their countries. Prior to that, I also worked in Nigeria at a leading investment bank. So my background has been domestically here in the United States. I've also worked at an advertising agency and was able to work on projects of the Native American community on different issues impacting them. So kind of coming full circle now, working at the CBC at a critical time where we have seen social justice and police reform issues right at the forefront, and on top of it, the impact of COVID-19 and how that has impacted the African-American community and all communities of color during this period. And so just having that front seat lens, but also being a part of the process and trying to drive legislative change and making it a priority has been a great experience for me and an eye-opener to a lot of the things that's already been happening and where those gaps are and how we can use our voices and how we can really use communications as a strategic tool during these times.
Okay, great. Thank you, Toyin. I'm just going to let Toyin sort of take the lead here and let you and Chelsea have a discussion for us about how we can communicate culture changes both within our organizations and more broadly.
Great. So Chelsea, it's really good to meet you, and it's always good to have another conversation with another communications professional, because sometimes I feel like we're in this space and our roles are so critical in not just crafting the message, but just even down to like the words and when we release the message and how we release the message and who we release the message to. So I just want to, kind of have a conversation with you today, comms head to comms head, about, what we've seen and how we as marketing communications professionals can use our talents to fight social justice. So maybe you could tell me a bit more about what you've done, and I can talk through our time this summer, especially given, all that has happened concerning social justice issues these last few months.
Yeah, totally. Definitely very happy to be in space with you, and appreciate the work that you're doing on the Hill and with our members of Congress and in the House as well. So yeah, excited about this. When I was at WVU, I was deeply, deeply committed to learning how to be the best storyteller I could be. I had no idea that I would end up in communications work, being in relationship to folks in movement in the way that I am. And I think it really speaks, at least for me, to the power of story, right? So when we're talking about messages and framing and narrative power and all of these kind of wonky jargonist terms that like communicators use, what we're really talking about is using powerful stories to reach people's hearts, to change people's minds, to pull people along into deeper alignment, and to help people have access to information that they need to make decisions, informed decisions about their lives. So for me, my work has, really always been rooted and committed to elevating the voices of people of color, and specifically Black people. And I think, many of us who find ourselves in this, doing this work in this moment, have had relatively, non-traditional journeys into this work. But for me, I really do feel like my path has been relatively consistent. I worked as a reporter and an editor, and was the reporter and the editor at the Dominion Post, as one of the places that I worked, who was in the newsroom talking about racial justice, right, in 2011, in 2012, and 2013, before the nation kind of moved into this pivotal moment of really reckoning with what was happening to folks of color across this country because of state-sanctioned violence. So moving out of that space of being the storyteller, decided to go to school and learn a new skill set to help expand my ability to tell stories, and to use my skill set to elevate the voices of folks who have historically been erased and marginalized, and getting a communications degree and really learning about narrative and what it means to build narrative power from the other side, right? As like people in the media, we think about narrative and framing very differently, but then having the opportunity to be on the other side of that was a tremendous opportunity. And I had no way of knowing that as soon as I graduated and had taken a job at a really prestigious firm in DC called Fleischman Hillard, that Ferguson would happen, right? So now these issues that had always really been a part of my life as a Black woman, but as a storyteller, right, issues of systemic racism, systemic oppression, patriarchal violence, all of these things that obstruct our people from accessing the things that they need. Now, all of these things that, some of us knew about, some of us wrote about and talked about, were in the forefront and were dominating the mainstream. So for me, what ended up happening was I realized that what was happening on the ground in communities around the nation during that period of time was not happenstance. It was not an isolated incident. We were moving into a space of racial reckoning. And for me personally, I knew I could not be of my best and highest use working at a corporate PR firm. So I left. I left in 2014. And my next job after that was leading the youth criminalization narrative work at the Advancement Project, which is a national racial justice and social justice organization that does tremendous work in supporting organizations, grassroots groups around the country. And it's, and it's been wild. It's been a wild ride. I feel like I haven't had a moment to take a breath since 2014, because we have actually been, as communicators, but also people who are in movement, at a point where it feels like the assaults on our folks are unrelenting, and COVID has just magnified all of the disparities that exist in this country. So it has been a very intense period of time to be someone that does social impact or social change communications, whatever you want to call it, communications of any kind, really, because now everyone has to figure out how to talk about what's happening, right? All of all of our comrades and all of our colleagues in communications and marketing, public relations, all of us have to figure out how to message this, how to talk about it, how to pull what's happening out in the world into our organizations. And that's not easy. For me, the way that I've been able to do it is because I use the principle of value-based messaging, right? So I also, to be frank, don't work with organizations, and I have the privilege of being able to only work with organizations who have made a commitment to being in alignment with folks fighting for change, who have made a commitment to ending state-sanctioned violence, who have, who are in alignment with the movement for Black lives, which is a primary part of my work. So the narrative work has been interesting, and I'm happy to talk more about it, but I'd love to hear, Tanya, a little bit about how this has been for you, like what this moment has been like for you, working in a pretty different space than I am in.
Unmute myself. So thank you. And you touched on a lot of points, and I was taking some notes. And for me, I think this year has been very transformative in many ways. One thing my boss generally says a lot is, there has to be an inside-outside strategy. And so for, the organizations that have been working on grassroots, and really, pushing the messaging and this from the outside has been really influential to push the work on the inside for legislative change. Let's see, how did this start for us? Issues of police brutality and social justice have always been a priority for the Congressional Black Caucus. It has always been a priority for the members of the Congressional Black Caucus, and you can see this through the different legislation and types of bills that members have brought forward year after year after year. But this year was different. And sometimes it takes that moment. My boss talks about, the Rodney King, situation. It's about almost 20 years ago. And at that moment, she was so sure that justice would finally be served. And even then, after everything was caught on camera, justice was not served. And so here we are, fast forward, years later, we are still seeing the same things happening over and over again. And the same stonewalls inside of Congress, not giving us an actual opportunity for change. But what I believe happened this summer, you tackle on the impact of COVID-19, but more so the issue finally hit everyone. You realize that this is not just a Black America problem. This is an American problem. And as this movement continued to brew for several years, and the use of digital media just expanding this in ways, issues of police brutality and social justice, you start connecting the dots globally. And so as you can see from what's happening right now in Nigeria and its End SARS movement, it's a movement that even continues on the same issue of police brutality and social justice and identifying the ills of our society and of our various societies, and noticing that there's a culture change of people speaking up. And so now as lawmakers, they are no longer in a position to just do business as usual. Combating with what your constituents are experiencing with COVID-19 on top of it, you have to be connected, and you have to engage with people. You have to listen to the story. You have to identify what your role is going to be as a lawmaker in this moment. And so for us this summer, we saw a couple of things kind of spiral back to back to back to back. And so as Chelsea said, our country reached a, moment of racial reckoning. It's not that this stuff hasn't been happening. And so even internally, I will say when the situation of the protests had started picking up across the country, I will say that, I started receiving, emails about how do we actually communicate this? And one of the immediate things was, well, this is a protest and these are not riots. And so being able to effectively help with cultural sensitivities and making sure that our members are communicating to their constituents and taking in that this isn't a one-time thing, that this is actually a systemic issue that's been impacting, of course, the African-American community, but other communities of color. And we're in a period right now where, we're seeing heightened levels of racism, xenophobia, racist rhetoric, and so forth. And so, with the speed of digital media, we have to be very, very careful in the language we use and how we are ensuring that we are supporting protesters, and we're supporting, our democracy, because protesting is a democratic, it's a part of a democracy. And so one of the things that I feel that our role in this moment as a CBC was not just to on the policy side, but also in helping our other members who are non-CBC members effectively communicate with their constituents, making sure that they are letting their constituents know that I'm supporting this type of legislation. And so for us, we championed the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, and we didn't just do that on our own. We engaged organizations on ground. We wanted to hear what they had to say. We wanted to let them know these were the bills. Some of them were on ice, but here we are years later, and this is our time. This is our moment. What can we get on the slate first? And making sure that we break that down to the average American, that, banning no-knock warrants. I think before the situation of, before the murder of Breonna Taylor, how many people really knew that no-knock warrants existed? And so now you have talking points where people are saying no-knock warrants. You're having people saying end qualified immunity. We didn't even know what that was. So being able to break down, the barriers of legislation to the average American has been a crucial part of my job this year. And I think when we understand what those barriers are, then we know what our power is. We know what a vote means. It's not just ticking off a box. We know what that exchange is, short term, but also long term. What does this person represent for me? And so for policy, I took it from that perspective because I've worked in the investment banking space, and I will say that that's probably one of the most complicated type of communication to ever get down to people, because if you're not an analyst, you do not care about a bullish market or earmarks or things like that. But what does that mean to the average person in terms of their investments and what they have in their pocket and what they take home and how they're able to build wealth for themselves and their family? That's the goal. And I think with communications, regardless of the sector you're in, it's about being able to tell that story. How does whatever it is that you guys do impact the average person? And when you're able to do that, I think that that's where things start to click. That's when people start to speak up. We are seeing people go beyond just saying Black Lives Matter now to, specifics. We want this. We expect organizations to do this. We are, expecting policies that look like this. So it's not just about a hashtag anymore. It's about what does that hashtag mean to our every single day, our jobs, the places that we go to, the restaurants that we eat at, the legislators that we support. That's, for me, the important and crucial role to communications. And so I think that if as a communications professional, yes, we are going to be skilled at the writing, and yes, we are going to be skilled at, posting on social media, but ultimately, what is the end goal? What do we want to push? And I think when you're able to do that as a communications professional, you become more effective and strategic for your organization. And you can even find your role going from communications to advisory, because then you can advise your principal or advise your organizations of where we need to be going. So this is a focus area that we need to really focus on, because we're hearing from people based on this. We're seeing that, Black maternal health is a problem. So how do we start addressing that? How do we prioritize this thing that we're doing? Right. When people talk about environmental justice, for us, what I looked at it was tying it to COVID-19. COVID-19 is disproportionately impacting, communities of color, African Americans, and Hispanic communities. But why? And if you look at a lot of the environmental justice issues and things that you're fighting for as far as policy and these long bills, it's ultimately for the safety and, air quality, issues in buildings, the cleanliness of places. A lot of these issues are causing people to be sick. And if you're causing people to be sick and then they have these underlying issues, well, they're more, susceptible to dying from COVID-19 or other sorts of issues. So you are able to then tackle the problem. And then you're able to say, but this person is fighting for this. So it's not just about saying environmental justice, but you know that asthma that you have, or you know this particular thing that's bothering you, or you know, you all have experienced, we can use, you know, we could say Flint. You know, Flint is a perfect big example, but I'm sure we've seen this in other parts of the country as well. Or why is a cluster of people in this particular area having cancer? What is in the area that's causing that? That's how you bring policy and bring these really complicated topics down to people. And of course, working with the grassroots organizations on the outside can help you then truly make sure that you're crafting policy that hits the mark, and not just throwing something, you know, throwing spaghetti on the wall and trying to figure out who will be there, or assuming that people nowadays are not informed. I do think that communications has to become more, as communications professionals, we're becoming more challenged because people are empowered now. People are seeing what's happening in different places. People are connecting the dots, and you can't afford to be on the other side, assuming that your constituents are okay with your two paragraph press statement, or your basic press statement that really said nothing. We have to be able to be more effective in our responses.
That's right. That's right. I see we have some questions coming in. That's so exciting. And hey, y'all in the chat, thank you for the questions, and we'll definitely answer those. I think, you know, one thing that, and I'm reading, and I know that, you know, as communications professionals, especially those that are in the fee-for-service agency, right? Those of us that have actual clients, and those of us that are working in service to community in different ways, the challenge of figuring out how to message to different stakeholders is always on the table. There's never a moment in my career where I haven't had to consider who my audiences are, where they're at, and how I need to reach them. And one of the things that I think has been really transformative to see across communications work is really that the work of radical communicators is part of the reason why we've seen this now global shift in the way we approach messaging. Well, I think folks would probably in some sectors call it like social good or social impact work. The work of folks in the movement for Black lives that are working with lawmakers on the Hill like yourself, right? Folks that are actually in deep relationship and connected to communities that are experiencing these things that we're talking about every single day. It really shows the power of communications work and marketing and strategic communications broadly, because the ways in which we are messaging right now are shifting the ways that corporations are engaging with partners. They're shifting the ways that different institutions are writing policy, are going after grants and funding, are figuring, you know, it's been transformative. And when I think about the kind of pivotal moments where we saw those real shifts in the ways in which we were talking about issues of systemic oppression, right? The reason that Black Lives Matter as a call to action, which is exactly what it was when, you know, my comrades Alicia Garza and Opal Tometi and Patrisse Cullors said hashtag Black Lives Matter in response to the non-indictment of George Zimmerman, whatever his name is, so unimportant, George Zimmerman, after the death of Trayvon Martin, the murder of Trayvon Martin. That was a call to action for folks. And because of the power of social and digital media, it then became a rallying cry heard across the country, but it was crystallized and became a movement deeply connected to grassroots organizations, to people in communities who were feeling and living these things every single day, because of the ways in which we were telling story, because of the messaging, and because of the fact that it was actually connected to people doing the real work. And one thing that's, I think, difficult for folks to remember, because the past 4 years of our existence as Americans has been so tumultuous, regardless of what side of the aisle you sit on, I think everyone can agree that this has been a very, very troubling time. And it's been a very hard moment, especially for folks living their lives on the margins, right? But it has been interesting to see the response to the ways in which that narratives have evolved, right? So we saw Black Lives Matter pop off on digital media, strategists grabbed hold of that, and the next thing you know, it's not just, you know, something that people are saying on social media, it's something that folks are talking about. It's become a part of the national discourse because of folks organizing on the ground. And the conditions that made that possible were not just because people were still upset about Trayvon or Oscar Grant or all the other Black people that we had lost at the hands of the state. It happened because we were in a moment where folks had really been living under the ideological, you know, state, like really it was a statement at that time that we were living in a post-racial society. So when we started to see that contrast, right, like Obama did not bring about a post-racial America if Black people are still being shot by the police, if Black people do not have access to the things that they need to live safe and healthy lives, right? So then we end up in this 4-year moment, right, from 2014, well, not 4 years, 2014 to 2016, right, this 2-year period where we're really challenging narratives around justice. We're challenging dominant narratives and messaging around what it actually means to be someone who is committed to social justice. And the ways in which organizations around the country and the way communications people working within those companies had to adjust was really transformative, right? Like you said, you couldn't just go from, you couldn't just get away with having your regular press statement that says, you know, we stand in solidarity with blah, blah, blah. Now folks are actually being held to account about how are you actually doing that? What does solidarity look like? How are you actually standing in alignment with the values that you said you have as an organization? And really the power of messaging and digital strategy was really at the heart of a lot of that. Another thing that feels important to name, and I see one of the questions here is asking specifically about Black Lives Matter. There really is, there's a huge story to be told there about the communications work that has happened the past few years, right? And we definitely don't have time here to get into it, but I think what has felt powerful is that people have acknowledged that if it would not have been for folks standing up in 2014 in Ferguson, we would not have had several movements that have grown, many of which were, largely catapulted by social media, but we wouldn't have a Me Too movement if folks hadn't have taken to the streets in Ferguson, and if people would not have started to tell stories differently, right? If communications people like us were not in direct relationship and direct communication with media, with editors and producers and different storytellers and creators about how they had to shift and transition to accurately document what was happening, we wouldn't have, the resistance that we have against this current administration had there not been all of those years of people really standing together and having a critical conversation. And that's the thing that I've always loved about journalism and about communications work and all forms of digital work that engages people across spaces, is that it puts us in a position to have critical conversation in ways that we otherwise would not have access to, right? And I know that, folks have varying levels of opinion around strategy, right? There's all kind of communication strategies that people use. Some folks feel like earned media is the only, is the best way to go about telling a story about your organization or messaging to a stakeholder. And, I have used all of them in my career, in both corporate communications and movement communications. And I think what I always circle back to is like the messaging that works and the messaging that stands the test of time and actually gives us narrative, like substantial narrative shift, is that's rooted in values. And I think you spoke to this a little bit as well when you were sharing, right? And the reason that COVID and the impact of COVID has been so intense for people is really because the stories that have come out and the fact that folks have had at this point six or 7 months of being forced to live in this reality has really shown people, like you were saying, the interconnectedness of all of these issues, right? There is absolutely, and we have known this for years, but there is no way to talk about and message about police brutality and state violence and not at some point end up talking about access, like access to healthcare or access to education, equitable access to education, access to housing, the environmental crisis. All of these things are interconnected. And what I think, just like this notion of the post-racial society that we were living in provided the conditions for people to really stand up like they did in 2014, COVID provided the conditions for people to really mobilize across race and across, religion and politics and all of the things, right? People were able to mobilize and galvanize around this particular moment because COVID acted as almost like a leveler, right? People who had never before cared about state violence, right? Or never thought that state violence in all of its different forms, from police violence to the obstruction of folks' ability to cast a vote, right? Folks who had never experienced homelessness, joblessness, who had always had access to the things that they need. COVID came in and showed them a whole different reality. We have millions of people that have lost jobs, that are in the midst of housing instability, that have lost family members and loved ones to COVID, right? Whose people have died because of a failed response, in my opinion, a failed response to what is now a global pandemic that does not seem like it's gonna let up, and that has disproportionately killed Black people and folks of color, right? So as another kind of pivotal moment, COVID has shown people, wow, like all of these conversations that I've avoided, or hearing about, you know, police violence and state violence in the mainstream, I never paid attention to it, but now I feel something different. My experiences have shifted in such a way that now there's that connectivity through humanity that is necessary for messages to stick. So when we're thinking like about different stakeholders and the folks that we have to message to across audience, it's like, for me, always about the values. What is the thing that I know that will reach someone else and help them make that informed decision, or help them think differently, or shift an assumption, right? And it always boils down to the things that people care about: their families, their homes, their communities, their ability to take care of themselves. And it sucks that it has to be that we've seen such change happen, really transformative change happen at the expense of people's lives. It really is painful that change has to come at, you know, the expense of such grief. But as communications people, and as people who are in the fight and who are actually seeing, you know, we're able to see down the road, it does also give you some hope, right? That the messaging that's happening, the narrative work that's happening is effective, right? We went from, you know, concepts like defunding the police, that in 2014, we're still a part of the conversation, but we're not in the mainstream because folks thought they were too radical, or they were just too outside of the realm of possibility, and it would never work, right? Abolition is just too far-fetched of a thing, it'll never work. Just now, 4 years later, I think, because obviously I can't count, 6 years later, 2014 to 2020, 6 years later, that messaging has made, and that's the power of framing and the power of messaging, right? Now that idea, whether you believe it or not, has become a part of the national lexicon. It has become commonplace for folks. There's no one that lives here in the United States that has not at least once heard, seen, or engaged with the idea of defunding the police. And that is the power of narrative, right? And the power of good messaging, strategic messaging, especially value-based messaging that's connected to people's real lived experiences.
So in here, thanks so much, Chelsea. Someone had asked, sorry, let me check here. Kaya, you asked about, you know, communications of the Black public spheres heading now. The Black Lives Movement is global. And I think I mentioned this in my introduction about, we're in a space right now where we are seeing people around the world demanding that their government be accountable, and they're demanding transparency, and they are learning what it means to be in power. And I think, as Chelsea mentioned, you know, Black Lives Matter was a call to action for a lot of different things. Now, it may have started out of a social justice movement, but that is something that we are seeing people now say, well, if you say Black Lives Matter, what about the wealth gap? What about pay gaps? If you're saying Black Lives Matter, why are, you know, are Black voices at the table? If you're saying Black Lives Matter, are Black politicians able to get a chance at leading? If you're saying Black Lives Matter, why are we still being treated ineffectively in the healthcare system? If you're saying Black Lives Matter, you know, it's trickling down. And so, you know, to the next question here about, you know, when we're advising stakeholders on messaging, advice I would give, because I've been in this position this summer where, you know, we had to advise the entire caucus on messaging, is one, it's really important to, as communications professionals, we do have to listen to what's going on. And so for me, you know, when I came into this role, I wanted to see what the gaps were in terms of people understanding what the Congressional Black Caucus actually does, and what we know we do, and what other people believe we do. And there's a big disconnect here. However, while there's a disconnect, what I noticed is that the commonality is that people expect the Black Caucus to be their voice, and to be their voice within Congress. Now, we could get into the weeds of, well, we don't actually, it's not the caucus that actually does legislation, because we're not a committee, but our members, it's through our members. that's nor here nor there because people do not care. Democracy must deliver for them. And they see us as a voice on issues that are important to them. And so being able to operate within that space, I took that perspective and of course, working with the chair and then the rest of my colleagues on how do we speak up on certain issues? You know, how do we make sure that we have a voice on all of this stuff? Because as things were brewing outside, we knew what that would mean for us policy wise, but it also means that we still had to say something. It also means that we still had to be an advocate. We are an advocacy tool. We are an advocacy piece for the Black community in America and actually a Black community globally. Because when issues of police brutality or even issues of immigrants Black immigrants at the border who were neglected, they came to us. Specifically to us. And we cannot just say, well, technically you need to go to Homeland Security or you need to go here. No, they expect the Black Caucus to be their shield, to be their place. And I noticed that our growth on social media platforms was rising exponentially. And I shared it with the chair and I said, what this means is that people are coming to us. In this moment of racial reckoning, everybody was coming to us. Our people were coming to us and everybody else who needed help on what to say was coming to us. So we are being looked at as, well, what is the caucus going to do about this? And so we needed to make sure that we were careful in our language, but we were speaking in a way that we were connecting to our community. And so on this messaging, on advising your stakeholders on messaging, we're in that position. Sometimes we as communications professionals, we have to be able to say, look, this is what people are saying. And I know you want to, write, you want to say this, but you got to connect it to this. And you have to be able to say it like this. We don't describe it this way. I had to, be more proactive in my messaging. And it was something that I was a bit shocked that, oh, well, you don't know that you don't call it a riot, that it's actually more peaceful protesting. But what I eventually saw was this was an opportunity for us as a caucus to be that voice, to not just be the voice, of course, externally for our constituents, but even for our fellow members of Congress. Everyone looked to us. And so we needed to lead. And this was our moment that we could actually narrate, tell the story, use it to influence policy, and it worked. And that's why we got the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act passed in the House. And it was overwhelmingly supported by Democratic members, but also some Republican members. So in my book, that's a bipartisan bill, because at the end of the day, we realized that the issue of police brutality is an American issue. It's a problem. And it's something that, whether you are a Republican or whether you are a Democrat, it is impacting your constituents, people who came out to vote for you. And so here in your space, you are a lawmaker, and that's what you do. And we're going to help communicate it. And we're going to get together and show that we are working together to fix this issue. But it took work inside. It took us being a guide. And that's why I think it's very important that in communications and that in these organizations that there's diversity at the table, because our perspectives are very important. And not just having diversity, but having equity in these conversations. To be able to come there and say, as Chelsea mentioned, no, this isn't this, prioritizing this issue and making sure that you're communicating this to your constituents, because they're not always going to even look like you, but that doesn't mean that their issues get ignored. So I think that
that feels, I didn't mean to cut you off, but what you said struck me, and I'm reading back to this question about stakeholders. I think the question, right, and you alluded to this, is like, we have to be the people sometimes in the room that are asking, like, what are you actually afraid of and what are you willing to sacrifice, right? So in terms of being able to take a bolder stance, right, if companies or organizations see what's happening, they actually are hearing about the impact that what's happening in the world is having on their members, their community members, or folks that they're in relationship to, other stakeholders, right? There's a lot, I'm assuming for most people, there's a lot to lose. So being the person in the room, communicators are often the person in the room, like, what do we lose if we don't say this? Like, what are you gonna lose if you don't stand up and say that the murder of Black trans folks is not okay? What do you lose if you actually don't stand up and say that the assault on LGBTQIA folks is unjust, right? And that's a hard position to be in, right? But when you're thinking about messaging and creating messaging that is going to be resonant, you're also thinking about, a lot of times, kind of the opposite side of the reputation protection, right? So I am in a position of working with folks that are in deep alignment and commitment to these values, but I have been in positions where that's not the case, right? Where you're dealing with reputation management also, which is just a real part of the job. So for a company, right, that, you know, would internally like to say something that maybe would be deemed a little bit more radical than their usual line of messaging or the ways in which they engage, right? Making a decision to step out of that doesn't just have ramifications for the stakeholders, right? For your people that buy your product, or the people that attend your school, or the people that are in relationship with you. It could have real repercussions on the institution, the organization's ability to exist, the ability to maintain good relationship, or just to maintain its reputation. But I think what the movement has done, and I would actually really love also to shout out Kaya here. I see I have a WABJ family member on board here who's asking some really great questions in the chat, is that, like, there's not a moment in time in this moment, right, where not taking a stance on something is actually an option, right? And I think it's to Toyin's point that, like, all our folks are not a monolith, regardless of what you're selling, what your organizational, you know, ethos is, or whatever. What's happening in this moment impacts everybody. So not being willing to make a decision about what are we willing to sacrifice, what are we willing to give, how much money are we willing to offer or to lose if we say this thing. That's the hardest part of making that decision about messaging the moment for stakeholders. And what I would offer, right, is if you are in a situation where folks are like, yeah, we believe that, but like, if we say, like Facebook was in, Twitter is a client of mine, Twitter is in this position as we speak, and I'm not going to tell their business, but like are in a deep, you know, a deep conversation about, like, you know, Facebook said a thing and lost $11 million in advertising. That's enough to close a company, a global company, right? So if you are in a position like that as a communications professional, where folks are like, I really want us to say something, but we cannot afford to lose all of our advertising dollars. We cannot afford attacks from the right? We won't sustain it. We won't survive. Whatever the case may be, there's always messaging tactics and strategies and communication strategies that you can use to move yourself in the right direction. And it often has to do with what some folks would call semantics, but for me, it's all like value-based messaging. If your company can't say Black Lives Matter, then what language in your external facing content can you shift to be in better alignment? If you can't say cops need to stop killing Black people, or you can't say we actually believe that the police that we need to be having a conversation about defunding the police, you can make shifts in language that pull you in the right direction, pull you closer to being on the right side of history, right? Like someone in the chat said, making the intentional decision to say that someone was murdered versus saying that there was an incident, or saying that they were killed, right? That type of a shift in language is really impactful. People start to pay attention to it. The more you do it, the more people ingest it, digest it, and it starts to become a part of how they're processing the moment and how they're making sense of things. If you're not allowed to say, or if you have like C3, C4 boundaries, like all of us have to do that C3, C4 dance now, and you can't say anything about the political moment, you can say something about the values that you want in the world, right? You can help your team, whoever it is you're working with, make that shift. You might not be able to say who you want to be our president in November, but what you can say is that you know that we deserve a world free of white supremacy, that we don't want 4 more years of the oppression of reproductive health, healthcare, and that we want people to be able to make self-determined decisions about their lives and their bodies. All of that falls within the realm of communication. So if you're someone in one of those situations, be it a global corporation, an institution like WV, or a small grassroots organization with 5 people, communications is powerful. And if you think critically about the moment, and if you listen to what's happening out in the world, you can always help move people through language closer to where they really want to be.
Mm-hmm. And if you're not in a not-for-profit space, because I've been in that other space too, most important thing is, what you don't say or what you do say affects your bottom line. And so that's where I think that you also have an advantage in that space as well, because if you're silent, or if you make the wrong, you say the wrong thing, then you can, cancel culture is real, and you can actually do more damage, but you could also do a lot of good. And so I think it's very important. And I think that's where sometimes the advisory aspect of being a communications professional can come in, being able to go beyond the press release, but going into, well, what are people saying? What is important right now? And what we say, if we say this, will this encourage, this kind of support for us? Because cancel culture, it does have an immediate effect, but continuous cancel culture has a long-term effect on your brand and ultimately your bottom line. For politicians, what they have to lose, their trade-off here is being in office. And so now when you have people who are expecting you or not expecting you to say certain things, you can't be silent on this issue. And that's why I think for us this summer, it was really important that the entire, caucus came together, and along with some other, members across the aisle, because you couldn't be silent on this issue, because being silent on this issue could mean losing your seat. And so it was up front and center for a lot of people. And sometimes that's what it takes. And pressure does result in that. I will say that, for things that you can't say, like for us, there are things that we can't say, but there are things that we can say. And what we can say is we can encourage people to participate in their democracy and what those civic activities are, especially when we know if you don't do this, the biggest impacts my group of people. So what do I need to do to mobilize my community? What if you are a B2, working in an organization that's you just target other professionals? Well, what's the gap? I think understanding what the gap may be in terms of their what they're not doing, being able to communicate that, and maybe having them participate in a particular, take an action, and have some sort of a call to action would ultimately change, your end goal. So if you can't say, hey, don't, we support this, you can make sure that everybody is doing this, which is fully legal, whatever that is within your sector. But I think being able to understand what people have to, even in the nonprofit space, you can then drive, well, this is the communication messaging my principal or even our organization needs to focus on to make sure that we're still within that space. So we do have another question here for academic and public health messaging. Do we recommend using African Americans or Black, and why? I think it's very important to make sure that you have diverse voices at the table, because there are very specific issues that you get, and not just issues, very specific perspectives based on people's experiences that you get when you have those voices at the table. And when you don't have those voices at the table, you are unable to truly get the solutions that you need. And so I think it is important, first and foremost, if you're having, especially in the healthcare space, as making sure that in messaging that you are covering as much as possible, and making sure that you have inclusive voices at the space. If you want to, if you're targeting issues that are impacting the Native American community, it might be very, important to have Native American voices in that space to be able to give you a perspective that you don't have. And that's the same for me. If I was, reaching out to another group of people, being able to get those diverse perspectives is really, really important, because we're not going to always see things the same way. And therefore that then shapes, okay, well, maybe we should say it like this, and then you learn things as well when you have other people from other spaces in, because ultimately that wasn't your experience. That wasn't what you grew up with. That wasn't what you were presented with. And so if you're living life going through, especially if you're going to be a communicator, only seeing things through your experience, you can't be effective at all, because you're only going to reach your base, and you're not actually going to be able to cross over and have an inclusive conversation to make sure that you don't lose the bottom line and you don't fall into cancel culture because of ignorance.
Right. I can also speak to Shelley's question, and thank you for asking that, Shelley. And, this speaks to what I was talking about a little bit, just about like, there's always shifts in language that you can use to make your messaging more inclusive, to actually pull yourself into a space where it is accurate, right? So specifically, right? You named, used the phrase like racial minorities. Minority is actually a word that is extremely diminutive and does not speak to the full breadth and power of communities of color. So as a communications professional and just someone who is in multiple advocacy spaces, we advise people not to say minority, right? Because we know that it's actually numerically not true, but we also know that it doesn't speak to the contributions of people of color in this country, and it does not speak to the full breadth and diversity and beauty and brilliance that folks of color bring to our society and to all societies across the globe. So that's one language shift that you could make right away that would really make a significant difference in terms of how people are engaging with your content, no matter what it is. To your actual question around using Black or African American, my recommendation, not just as a Black woman, but as a communicator, is to say Black if you are speaking about people who are living a Black experience from across the diaspora. And I say that because Black is representative, not just of a political, it's not just connected to a political ideology, which I think most folks feel. It's actually the language that we use because it speaks to the fact that there are Black folks living in this country who are not of African American descent, who are not the descendants of enslaved people. African American is language and a terminology that is directly connected to those of us who are the descendants of people who were in chattel slavery in the United States. So I would encourage you and everyone else listening to say Black if you are to.
Yeah, we do the same.
About Black people. African American has some historical and some legacy, you know, some nuance of legacy that people like to hold on to, but it's actually not reflective of the realities and the existence of Black people and of all Black people in this country. So that that would be my suggestion and my recommendation.
We've been in that boat too. We've definitely been in that boat too. And it's a back and forth. I think my style has leaned more towards using Black and Black people in America more, especially given the changes with, you know, AP now, you know, and the style guides with capital B. I'm more inclined to that because of these same reasons, especially as someone who's, you know, a child of, you know, Nigerian immigrants. The term, I know Black represents all of us. And so when we're speaking of the struggle or certain issues, a part of the struggle, I know that it also still encompasses us as well. And so, and even though I'm born and raised here, for me, that word is more comfortable. And I think culturally wise, what we're seeing right now is the use of that term a bit more, and people going back to using Black more than African American, because again, you know, when we speak of when we say Black, I know that I'm also talking about people of Caribbean descent. I'm talking people of African descent, even if it's 2-3 generations back. And I think that makes things a bit more holistic when we speak of that demographic. So we're in the same boat too. We do interchange with it, but I do think that we're leaning more towards using the word Black and Black people in America.
Yeah, and I would say, you know, that's just as communications people, and especially those of us who have to use digital strategies right now, and we can't do as much person-to-person work with folks that we're in working relationships with. You know, language and the ways in which we're making decisions about how we identify people and tell stories is actually really, really important. And I love what you said, Toyin, about making sure that there are people in the room that have these various lived experiences. And I always end up in conversations with folks who are well-intentioned, right? Who are coming to my firm or who are coming to the Movement for Black Lives, which is the biggest social movement in the history of this country, right? And it is a global movement, who are coming to us and asking, right, like, well, how do we make sure our organizations are like diverse and inclusive, right? So this term diversity and inclusion, like diversity, equity, and inclusion, is something at this point that makes me want to rip my hair out. Because for the most part, what it is people checking off a box, thinking, okay, like, do I have a queer or trans person at the table? Is there a Black person at the table? Is there an Indigenous person at the table, right? And while all of that is necessary, especially for those of us that do messaging and like comms work, right? Because we're telling these stories, and you are really in a position of being a steward of someone else's story, which is a real privilege and responsibility. You need people in the room to be a part of these conversations, but you also don't want to do it in a way that's tokenizing, because that's disempowering to people, right? So as comms people, we're often in the room with the decision makers, right? The folks that are making decisions about strategy, how our organizations are going to shift and pivot in these moments, to be in right relationship or to be a part of the change, right? To be on the right side of history, right? So I always encourage people to, like, when you are sitting at these tables and looking around and thinking about like who's not here that should be here, always do so, but also ask yourself critically, like, okay, these people are not in the room. The value add of not having them in the room is significant, but also, like, what are the strategies that we're going to use to go about making this a more diverse space in a way that is authentic, in a way that's, you know, with some integrity, and in a way that's actually going to lead to sustainable change. Because what you don't ever want to be a part of is an organization that's making a rapid decision, a reactive decision, because they don't want to be on the wrong side of history, or they don't want to be the one organization or the one university that didn't say something or that didn't do something. So you slap together all of these interventions that then fall apart, or that are actually not in service to the people that are the most impacted, right? So that doesn't always feel like communications work, but it often is, right? Because we're the ones that are holding the stories. We're the ones that are usually the most aware of the existing narratives and the stories that are being told about a thing out in the world. And it's our responsibility to bring the real into those rooms, right? And say, like, yeah, this is a moment of racial reckoning, but if we're actually going to address it, if we're going to say something, if we're going to create coalitions, or we're going to create, you know, working groups, we need to do it with some integrity, and we need to do it so that it's not in the service of us, but in the service of the folks that are the most impacted by the thing, whatever the thing is you're responding to. So I really appreciate that question. I see we also have one here, Tonya, from Clara. And I don't know, are we even supposed to be answering questions?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you both for addressing the questions. I will note that I hate interrupting this discussion, but it is 1 o'clock. I know you, Chelsea and Toya, may even have things that you need to get back to. I do think Claire's question is really great. So maybe we can just spend a few more minutes addressing your most frustrating and surprising moments, and then we'll try to wrap it up.
Yeah, for sure. So Claire has asked 2 questions here, Tonya, and they're both great. In terms of people of color is 100% more appropriate than minorities, just in my professional recommendation and personal preference. People of color over minorities, yes. People of color in place of Black is not actually like standard protocol for us. Saying people of color, if you're talking about diverse communities of folks, works fine, but people of color is not something that you would want to use instead of saying Black people, or instead of saying Latinx or Hispanic people, or instead of saying Indigenous people. So when you have the opportunity to talk about something that's impacting a particular community, name them. Name them. If you're talking about, you know, the collective impact, right? People of color is fine. I also see here that you asked, you're probably gonna laugh at this one too, Tanya, what's been the most frustrating thing and surprising thing about doing comms work the past few months? Yeah, a lot.
Should I go? Because I can tell you what the first thing that really shocked me was.
I was like, I need to get together on that one.
I think the thing that shocked me the most was that the lack of, I don't want to use the word lack, but the wide range of misunderstanding about issues of social justice and police brutality and things that impact Black America. I think that was a shocker for me. And because I've walked these shoes as being Black in America all my life, it's not a shocker to me, and you shouldn't say it like this, and this really does happen. That was a shocker to me. And having to almost spoon feed some of the communications, writing talking points, just certain talking points that were down to the basics, it bothered me at first because I expected people to already know the right thing to do. I expected, I expected people to take a stance regardless of whether the person was Black. Like, why did you need me? Why did you need the Black people on Capitol Hill to speak up about this? Why not you speak up about this regardless of who it was? And I realized, and also from some learning as well from my boss, was it also comes from a place of not knowing and not wanting to make the mistake. And so coming to you is not coming to us and coming to you is not out of laziness. Sometimes it could be, but oftentimes it's out of guidance. It's out of, I don't want to say the wrong thing. I don't want to do the wrong thing. And so you almost become you carry that burden of having to get it right. But looking back, I'm grateful that we did do that. I'm grateful that, the colleague I worked with to put talking points together, we did it because we knew that if we didn't, it was going to go left field. So the best thing to do is to actually give some guidance. If we want it to be said this way and we want the story to be said this way, it's better to give the guidance to those who have asked or did not ask, so that the right narrative can be pushed out there, as opposed to, just letting it be. And so it was a teachable moment for me. And, I took pride back in being that resource and knowing that, people are relying on you to help with that narrative. And you just got to come in there and do that and shape it. And when you shape it, then you can say, hey, look, teams are doing this. Who would have ever thought we would see a situation where the NBA players would have all of these things, slogans on their jerseys and on the in the bubble this year. Like, who would have thought that, like a year ago, that was something when we talk about, organizations going that far? No way. And now we're seeing that. What makes you think that we can't have, NBA players or athletes or so forth aren't going to say, and not just Black Lives Matter. We expect, we want more equity in these spaces. We want to be, we want this. We want to make sure that these laws are changed. Why not end no-knock warrants? Why not end, qualified immunity? We now have more people saying these things for a lot of laws that were kind of swept under the carpet, and we don't know anything until it, affects us. So I think that was one of my worst moments, or shocking moments. It wasn't worse, but shocking moments. But then turning that into a teachable moment to learn, okay, you're in a very important place right now. And so you need to use this power and use this power in the right direction.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I'll start with the positive, which is not usually where I start because everything's on fire. But to Toyin's point, right? The fact that we've propagated so many powerful messages about the value in our collective humanity, right? Because that's really what all of this is about, is that it's 100% time for the state to stop killing Black people, but it's also time for all of us to have access to the things that we have a right to, access to the things that we need to live safe, thriving lives without fear of harm, regardless of who you are or what walk of life you call your own, right? And I really feel super, super proud of the work that's come out of the Movement for Black Lives. And I keep saying that, and I'm assuming the people know what it is, but the Movement for Black Lives is the ecosystem under which the Black Lives Matter movement exists. It is an ecosystem of more than 150 organizations around the world, many of them here in the States, fighting for our collective liberation, right? So it's because of the work of the Movement for Black Lives and organizations like Black Lives Matter and Dream Defenders and the NAACP and all types of folks, Color of Change, that we are in a moment right now where we can have these really collective conversations about the world we want to live in, the world that we want to leave for our children. I'm super proud of the work of M4BL. I'm super proud of the fact that, people are putting themselves in uncomfortable positions and are actually really struggling with some of these issues, and some of the messaging that we're putting out is helping people to move from the space of feeling frozen in fear. Like Tanya's saying, not wanting to say the wrong thing, not wanting to make a mistake, not wanting to offend. People are really giving themselves the necessary space to challenge some of our long-held assumptions and to challenge the ways in which we think about our relationship to governance, not government, but like governance, right? The ways in which we want our democracy to work, right? So I'm really happy about all of that. There have been some tangible wins for me personally as a communicator, right? Like the work that my colleague here just mentioned about the NBA, like we were in deep conversation with the Players Association, with the Coaches Association, with the many different teams in the league about how they can stand up and be in solidarity with folks, right? How they can be of their best and highest use to their community, right? That kind of stuff is not just tangible in the way of people putting on a shirt or putting out a press statement, but it's really a part of culture shift. We know that arts and culture, sports, entertainment, all of these things that are a part of our everyday lives are equally important to moving us into a better place as a society. We often think that like politics is the end all be all, but like culture is powerful. The ways in which we use creative interventions is powerful. So from like the NBA, you know, making the stance that they've made to global corporations participating in the 15% pledge, right? That's led by a friend of mine, Elaine Welter-Roth, and designer Aurora James, right? They've gotten companies across the country and some internationally to commit to holding 15% of their shelf inventory for producers, designers, for, you know, folks that are creating different goods, but they're folks of color from communities of color. That's a huge shift in terms of how our economy functions, how our economy is set up. Really does not work in service to folks of color often. So things like that have come out of this moment, and that's tremendous. What's been frustrating is that my people are dying. My people are being killed still, right? I never disconnect myself from my lived experience as a Black woman. So while we are seeing these really tremendous and transformational changes, right? The fact that the people that are in the streets, even still right now, fighting for Breonna Taylor, fighting for Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd, they're not just Black people. They're people of all races, ethnicities, walks of life, right? And that's a huge shift from just a few years ago when it was mainly Black people fighting for Black people, right? So while I'm proud of that, there's a lot of grief that comes with watching folks be killed and there be no kind of accountability. That never gets easier, and it will never get easier, right? So while we as communication professionals can say that there are tremendous wins, right? Like M4BL has written a piece of legislation called the Breathe Act, right? That's been sponsored by, you know, it's not introduced yet, but it's been sponsored by brilliant legislators like Ayanna Pressley, and folks are now having critical conversations about how protest is always connected to policy, right? It's not just people out in the streets, you know, rioting and ranting and raving, right? There's never been a moment in our history where there was not tangible political change that wasn't connected to protest. So the fact that there's more nuance in the conversation about this political moment and about the protests that are happening around the nation makes me very happy, but I'm also deeply, deeply sad and grieving the loss of our community members. And I'm nervous about what's gonna happen in the next couple of weeks, but I'm also very encouraged because I believe in the power of Black folks and people of goodwill who are coming together in this moment to fight for a better world.
Thank you so much, Chelsea. I feel like that is sort of a perfect way to end this. I appreciate Chelsea and Toyin, you both for doing this. You're wonderful, and I really respect what you're doing. I posted this in the chat, but you can find this in other Integrate Online sessions online at integrate.wvu.edu, and you can also sign up to receive updates. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate you joining us today.
Bye, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.